Welcome back to our studio. What is God's mind? And where can we find God's mind? We can only find God's mind in His Word. We're going to carry on about the distorted image of God. And we're talking about when God created us and He's breathed His life into us. And the Trinity has been given to us, which is that the intimacy with God, the wealth that God has given to us. And not only that, He gave us the dominion to rule and actually to manifest His glory. So what happened to the image of God in the Garden of Eden? And I believe that we need to go back to the original made of intimacy in the Garden of Eden. So today we're going to talk about the intimacy with God has been distorted by human being in adultery and prostitution, in idolatry. God says to love Him with all our hearts, all our mind, and all our soul. But because we have sinned against God, we wanted to do our own thing. And we can go back to talk about Adam, the first Adam, and what happened to him. How did God create us? How did God create us, and how did He sustain the image? To sustain the image of intimacy, the wealth of God, and also to dominion and to rule. How did God sustain that? He gave it to us as human beings. So, these days we've seen leaders, and we've seen leaders in the church. We've seen leaders in government. We see leaders at home, parents and even youth leaders, children, whatever leadership. And it's actually a human thing. And most of the failure of leadership, it has to be connected to sex, money, and power. In my last studio, my last recording or last session, I talk about those three things: sex, money, and power. And these are, I'm going to break it down as we go on. We're going to talk about the intimacy. All these things are the sickness of the soul, has become an addiction of the soul that many leaders and human beings, all human beings have it. But we see it more in the church. We see it more in leadership of government. We see it more in families. So this is not just for the church. It is for all human beings. And I want us to take back to the beginning, and how did God created human being, and how did He want to sustain and cultivate intimacy? Intimacy is a key to connecting with God, and that connection is actually lead. If we don't connect to God, we connect to an idol. It's not only just an idol, we connect to adultery, and we connect to prostitution. And that is where the key of sexual immorality, it is very, very powerful in human nature, because it was given by God for intimacy. And I want to talk about the intimacy in the Garden of Eden and the importance of intimacy. So we're going to go back into the book of Genesis chapter 2, verse 8 to 17, and God created human being. And I'll just read it for us. And God created a paradise or a Garden of Eden, which is where the presence of God, this is where God rule and dominion and create a place. And this place is like the presence of God in Eden is actually the absolute presence of God for intimacy. And we're going to talk about the culture. We talk about the environment. We also talk about the intimacy with God. What is the original intention of intimacy. And this is how God show us or reveal to us in the book of Genesis after he created us. Now the Lord has planted a garden in the Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. So after God created us, he put inside of us, and every human being, no one is missing. No one is missing. It's not just for the Christian. It's not for only special people. No, it's all for humanity. So in humanity, God put inside of us intimacy, wealth, and his glory and dominion. How do we know that? Because when God created us from the dust, remember that when he picked us the dust and created us, the dust is part of his creation. So dust will never be God. We will never be God. But God himself created us out and molded us from the dust, and then he put himself in the dust. And it says it is his breath. The breath of God, because God said, let us make man in our image. So there is three of them, which is Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, which mean that if they put all together themselves in us as a human being, there are three Trinity in there. So one is intimacy, one is the wealth of God to increase into dominion and to multiply, and one is to rule and dominion with the power of his glory, which is the manifestation of the Holy Spirit. So these are three things, and I find it is a triangle that God has put the Trinity inside of a human being. Disobedience to God allow this image to be distorted. But before we going into the distorted image of God, I want us to talk about today about intimacy. Because if we can understand the real one, if you can understand the real money, you will understand the counterfeit money. You need to study the real thing to know the counterfeit thing. So we don't go straight into the distort of the image of intimacy until we talk about intimacy and understand what is intimacy. Because that's what God is wanting us to be restored. God wants to restore you and me back into the glory of his creation. And I believe that everyone has been created for a purpose. And God wants to restore us. And that's why he sent his son, Jesus, to die on the cross to restore the image of God in us, to restore the purpose, to restore the intention of God in our lives. So I believe that with my whole heart. I want to encourage you today that you bear with me as we go through this. But we need to go back to the original. So what is intimacy? What is intimacy? Intimacy, it is a place in our inner core. It's meaning our heart, our soul, our spirit is united to God. That's what intimacy means. So when we are intimate with God, it's not only to bring us to the fullness of the purpose of his creation, but actually it's also to demonstrate who our God is. Think about this. An intimacy of a man and a woman, they create a baby. That intimacy is for creation, to display actually the character and the glory, the wisdom, the beauty of the couple in one child. So that's what God wanted us to be. He wanted to bring us to his very presence, and in his very presence we surrender. We love God. We give our all to God. We return to God. And the fullness of the purpose of what He has created us to, it's going to birth out of us. So let's go back in here to see the beginning of intimacy. We're going to talk about the culture. We're going to talk about the environment. We're going to talk about the cultivation of that. So in the beginning, when God created, it says here He planted a garden. You know, in the book of Song of Song, Solomon talks about his lover. He talks about making love. He's talking about chasing his lover in the garden, searching. A garden is a place where there is beauty, where there is an atmosphere of love. And it's almost said that we can dance under the vineyard, where the grapes, and drink from it. So intimacy is a warmth of love and cultivating the best of us. So before we talk about intimacy, I believe that all of us as human beings, we have an interpretation of intimacy. And maybe it's because of what we have learned, what we have understood about education and biology or science. We understand what it means to have intimacy out there. Maybe we understand intimacy in the natural. And maybe there is a distorted thinking about intimacy. But I want us to come back to the mind of God about intimacy. Because intimacy, it leads to, if you don't have intimacy with God, you're intimate with something else. So we replace God with something else. We replace it with money. We replace it with idol. We replace it with a piece of wood. We replace it with gold. Whatever we replace God with, we are bringing it to be intimate with us. We love it more. But God says to us, in the book of Exodus chapter 20, it talks about the 10 Commandments. And God says, He opened it up and He said, you must love me with all your heart and all your mind, meaning that you will intimate with me, that you give me your love. You're not supposed to give it to the sun and the moon and anything else beside me. Don't even give it to animals or the birds in the air or even down underneath the water. We were not made to intimate with these things. We are made to be intimate with God. And I also want to bring it in. Intimacy with God, it brings the wholeness of satisfaction to the whole being of human being. And that's why we have seen so much people, so much leadership, so much pastors and fathers and leadership, youth leadership, whatever, all these things that have leadership, that most of them are failed because of sexual sin. And that's why I call it the disorder of sex, money, and power. But before I go to all that and the distort of the image of God, we need to go and see the original one. We're going to see the original intimacy with God. And how did God make it? Why did God make it? Why it's always for us that is the only thing that make us lose God because of sexual sin. We have seen more and more and more today of pastors has lost their churches and because of lost their leadership. Some of them, they have pioneered church for 40 years. Some of them has pioneered 50 years. And they have been found that they have been having secret sexual immorality in the church. And I believe that this, as we go into, we will come back after this and we talk more about that.